The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Friday evening in downtown Nashville. Kenny Rogers sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his weathered hands clutched to his chest, trying to steady his breathing. The pain had started 3 hours ago during soundcheck at the Grand Ole Opry, a crushing sensation that felt like an elephant sitting on his ribs, radiating down his left arm with frightening intensity. At 78, Kenny knew what this might mean. He'd lost too many friends to heart attacks, had seen too many talented souls leave this world before their time. Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, so many others who had shared stages and stories with him over the decades. But somehow, sitting in this sterile waiting room surrounded by the sounds of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps, he felt strangely calm. If this was his time, at least he'd lived a full life, touched a few hearts along the way. The waiting room was a study in human suffering and hope. A young mother bounced a feverish toddler on her lap, whispering soft lullabies in Spanish. An elderly man in overalls sat with his adult daughter, his gnarled hands shaking as he tried to fill out insurance forms. A teenager with a skateboard beside his chair nursed what looked like a broken wrist, texting one-handed while his worried parents spoke in hushed tones with the registration clerk. Kenny had arrived by taxi, not wanting to worry his family with an ambulance call that might turn out to be nothing. Now, 3 hours later, he was beginning to wonder if he'd made a mistake. The pain hadn't subsided. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, accompanied by a cold sweat that made his shirt cling uncomfortably to his back. Mr. Rogers. A young doctor in a crisp white coat approached, clipboard in hand. He looked to be in his early 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that comes with recent medical school graduation. "I'm Dr. Mitchell. I understand you're experiencing chest pain." Kenny nodded, following the doctor into a small examination room where the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like restless insects. The walls were painted an institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at them too long. Dr. Mitchell was efficient, professional, running through the standard tests with practiced precision. But there was something in his manner, a distraction perhaps, or simply the weariness that comes from seeing too many patients in too little time. The EKG machine beeped and whirred, producing a strip of paper covered with jagged lines that meant nothing to Kenny but seemed to tell Dr. Mitchell everything he needed to know. The blood pressure cuff squeezed Kenny's arm with mechanical insistence, the numbers appearing on a digital display that the doctor glanced at briefly. "Well, your EKG looks normal," Dr. Mitchell said, barely glancing at the printout before tearing it off and clipping it to Kenny's chart. "Blood pressure's a little elevated, but that's probably just anxiety. You know how it is. People your age tend to worry about every little ache and pain. I'm going to prescribe you some antacids and suggest you get more rest. The entertainment industry can be stressful, especially for someone who's been at it as long as you have." Kenny frowned, the pain still radiating across his chest like a living thing. "Doctor, I've never had heartburn that felt like this. It's different, more intense, and it's not getting better." "Mr. Rogers, I've been doing this for 15 years, Dr. Mitchell interrupted, with the kind of professional dismissiveness that made Kenny's stomach clench. "I know the difference between a heart attack and indigestion. You're fine, just stress and too much rich food. Maybe lay off the barbecue for a while." He chuckled at his own joke, already reaching for his prescription pad. Something in the doctor's tone reminded Kenny uncomfortably of all the record executives who had dismissed his music as too country or not commercial enough in his early days. The same condescending certainty, the same unwillingness to actually listen to what he was trying to say. Back then, it had been frustrating but not life-threatening. Now, sitting in this sterile room with pain radiating through his chest, the stakes felt considerably higher. "Could we maybe do some additional tests?" Kenny asked quietly, his voice carrying the polite deference that had been drilled into him by a Southern upbringing. "Just to be absolutely sure." Dr. Mitchell was already writing on his prescription pad, his pen moving with the swift efficiency of someone eager to move on to the next patient. "Mr. Rogers, we need to save our resources for real emergencies. You're experiencing classic anxiety symptoms, chest tightness, sweating, probably some shortness of breath. It's textbook. Take these antacids twice a day, and if you're still worried in a week, call your primary care physician. He can refer you to a therapist if the anxiety continues to be a problem." The dismissal was so complete, so final, that Kenny felt a wave of doubt wash over him. Maybe the doctor was right. Maybe he was just an old man letting fear get the better of him. He'd always prided himself on being tough, on pushing through discomfort without complaint. Perhaps this was just another test of that resolve. An hour later, Kenny found himself back in the waiting room, discharged but unconvinced. The pain hadn't subsided. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, accompanied now by a nauseating dizziness that made him grip the arms of his chair for support. He decided to wait a little longer, hoping it would pass, when a different doctor appeared in the doorway, scanning the room with practiced eyes. "Mr. Rogers? I'm Dr. Harrison. I heard you were here earlier. How are you feeling now?" This doctor was older, more seasoned, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle manner that comes from decades of dealing with frightened patients. Kenny felt a flutter of hope as he followed Dr. Harrison into another examination room, this one with a window that looked out onto the hospital's parking lot, where ambulances came and went like mechanical angels of mercy. "The pain is still there, doctor." "Maybe worse than before?" Kenny said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harrison listened to Kenny's heart with the kind of focused attention that the first doctor had lacked, moving the stethoscope to different positions on Kenny's chest and back. He checked Kenny's pulse, asked detailed questions about the onset and nature of the symptoms, even inquired about Kenny's family history and current medications. For 20 minutes, Kenny felt truly heard, truly cared for. But after all that careful examination, Dr. Harrison's conclusion was disappointingly familiar. "I think Dr. Mitchell was right," he said, though his tone was gentler, more apologetic. "Your heart sounds strong. Your rhythm is regular. Sometimes, especially for people in high-stress careers like yours, the body manifests emotional tension as physical symptoms. It's more common than you might think. The mind-body connection is very real, and after decades in the spotlight, dealing with the pressures of performance and public life, well, it's not unusual for that stress to eventually catch up with you." Kenny wanted to argue, to insist that something was wrong, but years of Southern politeness held him back. These were educated men, trained professionals with medical degrees and years of experience. Who was he, a country singer from Texas, to question their expertise? Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just getting old, letting his imagination run away with him. A third doctor, Dr. Patel, examined him another hour later when Kenny mentioned to a passing nurse that the pain was now radiating to his jaw and down his left arm. This doctor was younger than the first two, perhaps in his late 20s, with the confident bearing of someone fresh out of medical school and eager to prove his competence. "Mr. Rogers, I've reviewed your charts from the previous examinations," Dr. Patel said briskly, flipping through the pages with the speed of someone accustomed to processing large amounts of information quickly. "Two of my colleagues have already determined that you're not having a cardiac event. Your EKG is normal, your vital signs are stable. Continuing to seek multiple opinions for the same complaint suggests health anxiety disorder, which is quite treatable with the right medication. I'm going to prescribe you a mild sedative to help with the anxiety, and I'd recommend following up with a psychiatrist." Kenny felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest. Not the crushing pain of before, but the emotional weight of being dismissed, of not being heard or taken seriously. It was the same feeling he'd experienced in countless recording studios early in his career, when producers would cut him off mid-song, already convinced they knew what he had to offer before giving him a chance to show it. "Doctor, what if you're wrong?" Kenny asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of desperation that surprised even him. Dr. Patel looked up from his chart with the kind of patronizing smile that medical professionals sometimes reserve for difficult patients. "We're not wrong, Mr. Rogers. Medicine is a science, not guesswork. When three trained physicians reach the same conclusion independently, you can be confident in that diagnosis. Sometimes patients fixate on the idea of having a serious illness when the symptoms are clearly psychosomatic. You need to trust our professional judgment and work on managing your anxiety." By now, it was past midnight, and Kenny sat alone in the waiting room, feeling more isolated than he had in years. The emergency room had quieted somewhat, with only the soft sounds of medical equipment and hushed conversations between staff members to break the silence. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast everything in a cold, clinical glow that seemed to leach the warmth from human interaction. He closed his eyes, trying to pray, trying to find some peace in the midst of his fear and frustration. The pain was still there, a constant reminder that something was wrong, regardless of what the doctors said. He thought about his wife, asleep at home, unaware that he was sitting in an emergency room questioning whether he was having a heart attack or losing his mind. That's when he noticed her. She was small, perhaps in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. Her scrubs were faded from countless washings, a soft blue that had been worn to a comfortable gray in places. She moved through the emergency room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades caring for others. But unlike the doctors who had rushed through their examinations, she seemed to have all the time in the world for each patient, each family member who needed a kind word or a gentle touch. Kenny watched as she helped an elderly man to the bathroom, patiently walking at his slow, shuffling pace and offering her arm for support. He saw her bring a cup of ice chips to the young mother with the feverish toddler sitting with the woman for a few minutes when she began to cry from exhaustion and worry. There was something about her presence that seemed to bring calm to everyone around her, not through grand gestures or medical interventions, but through simple acts of human kindness that acknowledged the fear and vulnerability that brought people to places like this. Her name tag read Grace, and somehow that seemed perfect. She moved like Grace personified, bringing comfort to suffering with a touch, a smile, a moment of unhurried attention in a place where time was usually measured in heartbeats and insurance forms. Kenny was still watching Grace when the pain in his chest suddenly intensified, a crushing sensation that made him gasp and double over. For a moment, the world went gray around the edges, and he felt a terror unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Not just the fear of death, but the awful possibility that he might die alone in this sterile waiting room while medical professionals dismissed his suffering as imaginary. Grace was at his side immediately, though he hadn't called out or made any sound beyond that initial gasp. It was as if she had sensed his distress from across the room, some combination of professional instinct and human compassion that had drawn her attention to his crisis. "Sir, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm but alert, carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with medical emergencies. "The pain," Kenny managed to whisper, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "It's getting worse, much worse." Grace took his pulse, her fingers gentle but practiced on his wrist. Kenny saw her expression change subtly. Not alarm exactly, but a sharpening of attention that the doctors hadn't shown. She was counting, concentrating, feeling for something that went beyond the simple rhythm of his heartbeat. "How long have you been here tonight?" she asked, her voice still calm but with an undercurrent of concern that Kenny found both frightening and reassuring. "About 5 hours. 3 different doctors have looked at me. They all say it's anxiety, that I'm fine." Grace was quiet for a moment, still holding his wrist, her eyes focused on something the doctors had apparently missed. Kenny could see her processing information, weighing what she was feeling against what she was seeing, bringing years of experience to bear on his situation in a way that felt different from the hurried consultations he'd endured earlier. "Mr. Rogers, I'm just a nurse," she said finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I can't override the doctor's decisions, and I can't diagnose or prescribe treatment, but I've been working in emergency rooms for 28 years. And I've learned to listen to what patients' bodies are telling me, not just what the tests show on paper." She glanced around the emergency room, making sure they weren't being observed by any of the medical staff, then leaned closer to Kenny with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share dangerous knowledge. "There's something the doctors didn't check properly," she said quietly, her words barely audible above the ambient noise of the hospital. "Your pulse has an irregularity that's very subtle, easy to miss if you're not listening carefully. And the way you're breathing, the slight blue tinge around your lips, the cold sweat, these could be signs of something they're not seeing." Kenny felt his heart skip. Whether from hope or fear, he couldn't tell. "What do you think it is?" Grace looked around again, clearly conflicted about how much to say. "I think you might be having what we call a silent heart attack, or possibly unstable angina. It's more common in older patients, especially those with diabetes or high blood pressure. The symptoms can be very different from the classic presentation, you know, the crushing chest pain, the dramatic collapse you see in movies. Silent heart attacks can present with subtle symptoms that are easy to dismiss, especially if the EKG doesn't show the classic changes." Kenny leaned forward, desperate to understand. "But the doctors said my EKG was normal." EKGs can be normal in the early stages of a heart attack, or if the damage is occurring in an area of the heart that doesn't show up clearly on a standard 12-lead EKG. There are other tests, cardiac enzymes, serial EKGs, more advanced imaging, that can detect what a basic EKG might miss. Grace paused, her expression growing more serious. "Mr. Rogers, I shouldn't be telling you this. If the doctors found out I was contradicting their diagnoses, I could lose my job. I'm 56 years old, close to retirement, and I can't afford to start over somewhere else. But I've seen too many patients sent home with anxiety who came back in cardiac arrest the next day. What should I do? Kenny asked, his voice barely audible. Grace was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. You have a choice. You can accept their diagnosis and go home, hoping they're right. Or you can insist on seeing another doctor, preferably a cardiologist, and ask specifically for the tests I mentioned: cardiac enzymes, troponin levels, a more detailed EKG series. Be firm but polite. Tell them you want the blood work that shows if your heart muscle has been damaged. Kenny looked into Grace's eyes and saw something that had been missing from his interactions with the 3 doctors. Genuine concern for him as a human being, not just a set of symptoms to be categorized and dismissed. Why are you helping me? He asked. Grace's expression became distant, and Kenny saw a flash of pain cross her features. Because 6 months ago, my husband came to this same emergency room with chest pain. 2 doctors told him it was indigestion, maybe a pulled muscle from working in the garden. I wasn't working that night, wasn't here to advocate for him. Her voice caught slightly and she had to pause before continuing. He had a massive heart attack at home 3 hours later. The paramedics worked on him for 45 minutes, but it was too late. Kenny felt his chest tighten with emotion rather than pain. Grace, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry for me, she said, her voice growing stronger. Be angry, be insistent. Don't let them send you home if your body is telling you something's wrong. You know yourself better than anyone else does, better than any doctor who spent 15 minutes with you. Trust that knowledge. Will you help me? Will you stay with me when I talk to them? Grace shook her head sadly, the conflict clear in her expression. I can't. If they found out I was contradicting their medical opinions, encouraging a patient to seek additional care against their recommendations, I could lose my license. But I can tell you this, Dr. Elizabeth Chen is the best cardiologist in this hospital, probably in the state. If you can get someone to call her, even at this hour, she'll listen to you. She's one of the few doctors I know who still remembers that medicine is as much art as science. Before Kenny could respond, Grace stood up and walked away, returning to her duties as if their conversation had never happened. But she had left him with something invaluable: hope and a plan. And the knowledge that at least one person in this sterile, dismissive place believed that his life was worth fighting for. Kenny sat for a few minutes, gathering his courage and trying to decide how to proceed. He thought about his career, all the times he'd had to stand up to record executives and producers who didn't believe in his music. He thought about the years of rejection before The Gambler became a hit, the patience and persistence it had taken to build a career in an industry that was quick to dismiss anything that didn't fit the current trend. If he could fight for his music, surely he could fight for his life. Kenny approached the nurses' station with newfound determination, drawing on every ounce of quiet authority he'd learned from decades in the music business. The young man behind the desk looked up with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with too many demanding patients during a long shift. Excuse me, Kenny said politely but firmly, his voice carrying the kind of respectful insistence that was hard to ignore. I need to speak with Dr. Chen, the cardiologist. I've been examined by 3 doctors tonight, but I'm requesting a cardiac consultation. The desk nurse, his name tag read Marcus, looked uncertain. Sir, if you've already been seen by 3 doctors and they've cleared you, then surely a 4th opinion won't hurt anyone, Kenny interrupted, channeling all the quiet authority he'd learned from years of dealing with skeptical audiences and difficult venues. I'm experiencing symptoms that haven't resolved despite their reassurances, and I'd like a specialist to evaluate them. I believe that's my right as a patient. Marcus looked around the emergency room, clearly unsure of the protocol for this situation. Dr. Chen isn't on call tonight, sir. She's probably at home asleep. Then wake her up, Kenny said, his voice still polite but unmistakably serious. Tell her it's a patient with cardiac symptoms who's been dismissed by 3 doctors but believes he needs specialist care. If she refuses to come, I'll accept that, but I want to make the request. Something in Kenny's manner, not demanding or entitled, but unshakable in his conviction, made Marcus reach for the phone. Kenny could hear only one side of the conversation, but it seemed to involve a lot of explaining and some persuasion on Marcus's part. Dr. Chen will be here in 20 minutes, Marcus said finally, hanging up the phone. She wants you to know that if this turns out to be anxiety, you'll be responsible for the consultation fee. That's fine, Kenny said, settling back into his chair to wait. For the first time all evening, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. 25 minutes later, Dr. Elizabeth Chen appeared in the emergency room, still in casual clothes, jeans and a Georgetown University sweatshirt, but moving with the focused intensity of a true professional. She was perhaps 45, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of presence that inspired immediate confidence. Kenny could tell just from watching her interact briefly with the nursing staff that this was someone who commanded respect through competence rather than authority. "Mr. Rogers?" she said, approaching him with a directness that was refreshing after hours of medical bureaucracy. "I understand you're concerned about your heart." "Yes, doctor. I've been having chest pain for over 6 hours now. 3 doctors have told me it's anxiety, but the pain isn't going away, and I'm worried they might be missing something." Dr. Chen sat down in the chair next to Kenny, not standing over him like the other doctors had done. It was a small gesture, but it fundamentally changed the dynamic of their interaction, making Kenny feel like a partner in his care rather than a subject to be examined. "Tell me about the pain," she said, pulling out a notebook and pen. "Start from the very beginning and don't leave anything out. I want to hear everything, not just the medical symptoms, but how you felt, what you were doing, what made you decide to come to the hospital." For the first time all evening, Kenny felt truly heard. Dr. Chen listened to every detail, asked follow-up questions that showed she was really processing what he was telling her, and took notes that filled an entire page. When she examined him, her touch was gentle but thorough, and Kenny could see her mind working, processing information that the other doctors had apparently missed or dismissed. She spent extra time listening to his heart, moving the stethoscope to different positions, and asking him to breathe in various ways. She checked his pulse at multiple points, wrist, neck, ankles, and examined his fingernails and lips with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she was looking for subtle signs that others might have overlooked. "Mr. Rogers, I want to run some tests that should have been done hours ago," she said finally, her expression serious but not alarming. "I'm going to order cardiac enzymes, a more detailed EKG series, and a chest X-ray. I also want to do what's called a stress echo if you're feeling up to it. It's a way of looking at your heart function under controlled conditions." The other doctors said my EKG was normal. Dr. Chen nodded. "A single EKG can be normal even in the presence of a heart attack, especially if it's what we call a non-STEMI, a type of heart attack that doesn't always show up on the standard test. Sometimes we need to look at the changes over time, or check specific enzyme levels in your blood that indicate heart muscle damage." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Mr. Rogers, something about your presentation doesn't sit right with me. Your symptoms, the way you're describing them, the fact that they've persisted for so long. It's possible you're having what we call a silent myocardial infarction. The name is misleading because it's not really silent, you're clearly experiencing symptoms, but it can present very differently than the classic heart attack scenario." "How differently?" "Instead of the dramatic chest pain that sends people to the floor, silent heart attacks can cause more subtle symptoms, discomfort rather than agony, nausea, sweating, weakness. They're more common in older patients, diabetics, and people with high blood pressure. The danger is that they're often dismissed as something less serious, which means the patient doesn't get the immediate treatment they need." 2 hours later, Dr. Chen returned with test results and an expression that was both vindicated and concerned. Kenny had spent the time in a cardiac monitoring room, watching the numbers on various machines and trying not to think about what they might mean. "Mr. Rogers, I owe you an apology on behalf of my colleagues, Doctor," Chen said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "You've been having a heart attack, specifically what we call a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction, or NSTEMI. Your cardiac enzymes are significantly elevated, indicating that heart muscle has been damaged, and your serial EKGs show subtle changes that were missed in the initial readings." Kenny felt a wave of emotions, relief at being validated, fear about what lay ahead, and a deep gratitude toward Grace, whose whispered advice had possibly saved his life. "How bad is it?" he asked. "We need to get you to the cardiac catheterization lab immediately to see which vessels are blocked and how we can restore blood flow to your heart. The good news is that you're here now, you're stable, and we have excellent treatments for this condition. The fact that you insisted on further evaluation probably prevented this from becoming a much more serious situation." Dr. Chen's expression grew more thoughtful. "Mr. Rogers, can I ask what made you persist in seeking care when 3 doctors told you nothing was wrong?" Most patients would have gone home and hoped for the best. Kenny thought about Grace, about their whispered conversation in the waiting room, about the mysterious nurse whose advice had potentially saved his life. There was a nurse here named Grace. She encouraged me to trust my instincts and ask for the tests you just ran. I need to thank her. Dr. Chen looked puzzled, checking her notes. Grace? We don't have a nurse named Grace working tonight. Are you sure about the name? Kenny felt a chill that had nothing to do with his medical condition. She was here. Older lady, gray hair in a ponytail, very kind. She told me about the tests you just ran. Said I might be having a silent heart attack. Dr. Chen flipped through her paperwork, then picked up the phone and called the nurse's station. Kenny could hear her asking about staff schedules, specifically whether there was a Grace on duty. After a few minutes of conversation, she hung up with a perplexed expression. Mr. Rogers, I've checked with the charge nurse, and we don't have anyone named Grace working in our emergency department. We haven't had a Grace on staff here for several years. Before Kenny could process this information fully, he was being wheeled toward the cardiac lab, where Dr. Chen and her team would work to save his life. The procedure revealed two severely blocked arteries, the so-called widowmaker lesion in the left anterior descending artery, and a significant blockage in the right coronary artery. Without the intervention, Dr. Chen later told him, he likely wouldn't have survived the weekend. The angioplasty and stent placement took 3 hours, during which Kenny drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the controlled urgency of the medical team working to restore blood flow to his heart. When he finally woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit, his first thought was not of his own condition, but of the mysterious nurse who had saved his life. 3 days later, as Kenny recovered in the cardiac unit, he asked every nurse, every orderly, every staff member about Grace. No one had ever heard of her. The charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who had worked at St. Mary's for 15 years, was particularly helpful in the search. We did have a Grace Rodriguez who worked here, Patricia said, checking old personnel records. But that was in the late 1990s. She died in 1998, car accident on her way home from a night shift. Kenny felt goosebumps rise on his arms. What did she look like? Patricia pulled out an old staff directory with photographs. Here she is, Grace Rodriguez, RN. She was wonderful with patients, had this ability to sense when someone was in trouble even before the monitor started alarming. Kenny stared at the photograph. It was definitely the woman he had spoken with. The same kind eyes, the same gentle expression, even the same way of wearing her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Tell me about her, Kenny said quietly. Grace was legendary here, Patricia said, settling into the visitor's chair. She had this uncanny ability to spot problems that other people missed. I can't tell you how many times she would insist that a patient needed additional tests or a second opinion, even when the doctors thought everything was fine. She saved a lot of lives that way. What happened to her? She was driving home after a particularly difficult shift. We'd lost 2 patients that night, and Grace always took those losses hard. It was raining, and she apparently hydroplaned on the interstate. She died instantly. Patricia's voice grew soft with memory. The whole hospital was devastated. She was one of those people who reminded everyone why we got into healthcare in the first place. Sometimes, Dr. Chen said when Kenny told her about the mysterious nurse, when we're in crisis, we encounter exactly the guidance we need. Whether it comes from some kind of spiritual intervention, or from our own subconscious knowledge surfacing at the crucial moment, or from something else entirely, I can't say. What matters is that you listen to that guidance, whatever its source. Kenny spent his recovery time thinking about Grace. Real or not, living or dead, she had saved his life by encouraging him to advocate for himself, to trust his instincts when the experts dismissed his concerns. She had appeared at his moment of greatest need, offering wisdom born from her own experience and the kind of compassion that transcends the boundaries between life and death. A week after his discharge, Kenny returned to the hospital, not as a patient but as a visitor. He had asked Dr. Chen to arrange a meeting with the nursing staff, particularly those who worked the emergency room. About 20 people gathered in a small conference room, nurses, orderlies, technicians, and a few doctors including Dr. Chen. I wanted to come back and tell you about something that happened the night I was here, Kenny began, his voice still a little hoarse from the breathing tube that had been used during his procedure. I also wanted to thank you all for the care I received, particularly from Dr. Chen, who saved my life by taking my concerns seriously when others didn't. He told them the story of his encounter with Grace, describing how her encouragement had given him the courage to insist on further testing. He watched their faces as he spoke, seeing recognition and wonder in equal measure. "I don't know if what I experienced was real in the way we usually think of real," Kenny continued. "But Grace's message was absolutely real, that every patient deserves to be listened to, that symptoms aren't always straightforward, and that sometimes the people who spend the most time with patients see things that others miss." An older nurse named Dorothy raised her hand. "Mr. Rogers, I worked with Grace Rodriguez for 8 years before she died. What you're describing, her ability to sense when something was wrong, her dedication to patient advocacy, that was Grace exactly. She used to say that patients' bodies tell stories if you know how to listen." After the meeting, Kenny asked Dr. Chen to show him the hospital's memorial wall, where former employees were honored. There, among dozens of photographs, was Grace Rodriguez, exactly as Kenny remembered her, down to the kind eyes and gentle expression that had provided comfort in his moment of greatest need. Below her photo was a plaque that read, "Grace Rodriguez, RN, 1945-1998. She taught us that healing begins with listening and that every patient deserves an advocate." Dedicated by the nursing staff who learned from her wisdom and carried forward her compassion. Kenny stood before the memorial for a long time, understanding finally that some encounters transcend our usual definitions of possible and impossible. Whether Grace had been a hallucination brought on by cardiac distress, a manifestation of his subconscious knowledge, or something more mysterious, her message had been clear and potentially life-saving. Trust yourself, fight for yourself, and never accept dismissal when your body is telling you something's wrong. 6 months later, Kenny established the Grace Rodriguez Foundation, dedicated to improving patient advocacy in hospital settings and training medical professionals to listen more carefully to their patients, especially elderly ones whose symptoms might not fit textbook presentations. The Foundation's first initiative was a program at St. Mary's Hospital that paired experienced nurses with younger doctors, teaching them to look beyond test results and really observe their patients. The Foundation also funded patient advocates, nurses and social workers whose job was specifically to help patients navigate the medical system and ensure their concerns were heard. These advocates were trained to recognize when patients needed additional testing or second opinions, and they had the authority to request specialist consultations even when the attending physician disagreed. During the Foundation's launch event, held in the hospital's main auditorium, Kenny told the story of his heart attack and the mysterious nurse who had saved his life by believing in his right to be heard. "I don't know if Grace Rodriguez appeared to me that night in any physical sense," he said to the gathered crowd of doctors, nurses, and medical students. "But her spirit, her dedication to patient care, her belief that every person deserves to be listened to, that was absolutely real and absolutely present when I needed it most." In the audience, an older woman raised her hand during the question period. "Mr. Rogers, I'm Margaret Chen. No relation to Dr. Chen, just coincidence. I was Grace's supervisor for her last 5 years at the hospital. I wanted you to know that what you experienced that night, whether you want to call it spiritual or psychological or just coincidence, would have made Grace incredibly happy. She always said that the most important thing a healthcare worker could do was to help patients trust their own instincts." After the event, Margaret approached Kenny privately. "There's something else you should know about Grace. She believed very strongly that people who died with unfinished business, especially business related to helping others, sometimes found ways to complete that work. She used to say that love and compassion were forces that couldn't be stopped by something as simple as death." Kenny felt chills run down his spine. "Do you think she's still here somehow?" Margaret smiled. "I think Grace Rodriguez is wherever people are fighting to be heard, wherever compassion meets medical knowledge, wherever someone refuses to accept no for an answer when their life is on the line. Whether that's in this world or some other, I couldn't say, but her influence is definitely still here." The Grace Rodriguez Foundation went on to change protocols at hospitals across the country, training medical professionals to spend more time with patients, to listen more carefully to their concerns, and to remember that behind every set of symptoms was a human being deserving of respect and thorough care. The Foundation's motto, taken from something Grace had written in a nursing journal years before her death, was simple: listen with your ears, observe with your eyes, but most importantly, care with your heart. Kenny never had another heart attack, but he carried Grace's lesson with him every day. That angels sometimes appear when we need them most, that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the people who seem invisible, like a quiet nurse making her rounds, are the ones who see most clearly. Years later, when young medical students would visit Kenny to ask about that night, he would tell them, "I learned that pride can be fatal. that expertise without compassion is incomplete, and that sometimes the most important medical advice comes not from the doctor with the most degrees, but from the person who cares enough to really see you. The foundation grew beyond anyone's expectations. Within 5 years, the Grace Rodriguez Patient Advocacy Program had been implemented in over 200 hospitals across the United States. The program's success wasn't measured just in statistics, though those were impressive. A 30% reduction in misdiagnoses, a significant decrease in patient complaints about feeling unheard, and countless lives saved by advocates who insisted on second opinions or additional testing. The real measure of success came in the stories. Patients like elderly Mrs. Patterson, whose abdominal pain was dismissed as constipation by 2 doctors until a Grace Foundation advocate insisted on a CT scan that revealed a bowel obstruction requiring emergency surgery. Or young Marcus Williams, whose headaches were attributed to stress until an advocate noticed subtle changes in his speech patterns and demanded an MRI that showed a brain aneurysm. Each story reinforced the Foundation's core message, that patients know their own bodies, that persistent symptoms deserve persistent investigation, and that the most dangerous words in medicine are often, "It's nothing to worry about," when spoken too quickly or without sufficient investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had become the Foundation's chief medical advisor, often spoke at medical conferences about the night she met Kenny Rogers. Her presentations always included the same key points: the importance of listening to patients, the limitations of single tests or brief examinations, and the critical value of clinical intuition, whether it came from experienced nurses, concerned family members, or the patients themselves. That night taught me that medicine is not just about interpreting test results, she would tell her audiences. It's about seeing the whole person, understanding that suffering is real even when we can't immediately explain it, and remembering that our oath is to do no harm. And sometimes, the greatest harm we can do is to dismiss someone's pain without truly investigating its cause. The story of Kenny's encounter with Grace Rodriguez became something of a legend in medical circles, discussed in ethics classes and patient care seminars. Some students approached it with skepticism, viewing it as an anecdotal story that didn't belong in evidence-based medicine. Others found in it a reminder of the human elements that made healthcare more than just applied science. But for Kenny, the experience remained intensely personal and transformative, not just because it had saved his life, but because it had taught him something profound about vulnerability, advocacy, and the connections that bind us all together in our shared humanity. 5 years after his heart attack, Kenny received an unexpected visitor at his home in Georgia. Dr. Patricia Williams had been a third-year medical student the night Kenny was in the emergency room, shadowing Dr. Mitchell during his rotation. She had witnessed Kenny's initial examination and dismissal, though she hadn't spoken up at the time. "Mr. Rogers," she said, sitting in Kenny's living room with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, "I need to tell you something that's been weighing on me for years. I was there that night, watching Dr. Mitchell examine you. I saw how dismissive he was, how quickly he reached his diagnosis, and I knew it was wrong." Kenny set down his own coffee, giving her his full attention. "How did you know?" "My grandmother had a heart attack when I was in college. She described her symptoms to me afterward, the way the pain radiated, the nausea, the feeling that something was terribly wrong even though the first doctor told her it was just indigestion. When I heard you describing your symptoms to Dr. Mitchell, it was like hearing my grandmother's story all over again." Dr. Williams paused, struggling with the memory. "But I was just a student." Dr. Mitchell was the attending physician, the expert. I thought, who was I to question his judgment? So I said nothing. "What happened to your grandmother?" "She went home after that first ER visit, just like they wanted to send you home. But she didn't accept the diagnosis. She called her family doctor, insisted on being seen immediately, and he sent her straight to the cardiac unit. She ended up needing bypass surgery, but she survived because she refused to take no for an answer." Kenny reached over and patted Dr. Williams' hand gently. "You were a student. You weren't in a position to override an attending physician. But I could have spoken up. I could have asked questions, suggested additional tests, anything. Instead, I stayed quiet. And if it hadn't been for whoever it was that encouraged you to keep fighting, you might have died because I was too intimidated to speak truth to authority." "What did you learn from that experience?" Dr. Williams straightened up, her voice growing stronger. "I learned that hierarchy in medicine can be dangerous when it prevents people from advocating for patients. I learned that being right means nothing if you don't have the courage to act on what you know. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing a doctor can do is listen, really listen, to what patients are telling them. She pulled out a business card and handed it to Kenny. I specialize in emergency medicine now, and I run a program at our hospital that trains medical students to be patient advocates. We teach them that their job isn't just to learn from attending physicians, but to speak up when they think a patient isn't getting the care they need. Kenny looked at the card. Dr. Patricia Williams, MD, Director of Patient Advocacy Education, Atlanta Medical Center. Your story has become part of our curriculum, she continued. We use it to teach students about the importance of persistent symptoms, the limitations of single tests, and the value of trusting clinical intuition. But most importantly, we use it to teach them that they have a responsibility to speak up for patients, even when, especially when, that means questioning authority. Tell me about your program. We pair students with experienced nurses who teach them what to look for beyond the obvious symptoms: skin color, breathing patterns, subtle changes in behavior that might indicate something serious. We also teach them how to advocate diplomatically but effectively, how to ask for additional tests or consultations without undermining the attending physician's authority. Dr. Williams smiled for the first time since arriving. We call them GRACE students, medical students who are trained to be the voice for patients who might otherwise go unheard. It's been incredibly successful. Our hospital has seen a significant decrease in misdiagnoses since we started the program. Kenny felt a familiar warmth spreading through his chest. The same feeling he'd experienced watching Maria Elena Vasquez succeed with her music. Grace would be proud, he said quietly. I hope so. There's something else though, something I've never told anyone. Dr. Williams hesitated, then took a deep breath. The night you were in our ER, after Dr. Mitchell dismissed your symptoms, I went to the bathroom and cried. I was so frustrated, so angry at myself for not speaking up. When I came out, I saw an older nurse talking to you in the waiting room. I'd never seen her before, and when I asked other staff about her later, no one knew who I was talking about. Kenny's heart started beating faster. What did she look like? Gray hair, kind eyes, older scrubs that looked like they'd been washed 1,000 times. She had her hand on your wrist, taking your pulse, and she was talking to you very quietly, very intently. There was something about her presence that made me feel hopeful, I guess. Like someone was finally taking care of you the way you deserved. Did you hear what she said? Just a few words as I walked past. Something about trusting your instincts and not letting them send you home. She told you to ask for a cardiologist. Kenny and Dr. Williams sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the implications of what she'd shared. Do you believe in guardian angels, Mr. Rogers? Dr. Williams asked finally. I believe in the power of compassion to transcend ordinary limitations, Kenny replied. Whether you call that divine intervention, the persistence of love beyond death, or just the mysterious ways that human connection can manifest when it's needed most, I can't say. But I know that Grace Rodriguez saved my life that night, just as surely as Dr. Chen's medical expertise did. And now her influence is saving other lives through the foundation and the advocacy programs. That's the thing about true compassion, Kenny said. It doesn't end with one person or one act of kindness. It ripples outward, touching people you'll never meet, solving problems you'll never know about. Grace died 25 years ago, but her commitment to patient care is still healing people today. Dr. Williams stood to leave but paused at the door. Mr. Rogers, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't encountered Grace that night? If you'd just gone home like the doctors wanted? Kenny was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I think about it sometimes, but mostly I try to focus on what did happen, and what it taught me about the importance of speaking up, of trusting yourself, of never accepting dismissal when something feels wrong, and what it taught you about the connections between people. That too. I learned that we're all connected in ways we don't fully understand, that love and compassion create bonds that death can't break, and that sometimes the help we need most comes from the people we least expect, or from sources we can't even explain. After Dr. Williams left, Kenny sat in his living room as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. He thought about the chain of events that had started with chest pain during soundcheck at the Grand Ole Opry, and had led to the transformation of patient care practices across the country. He thought about Grace Rodriguez, whether she had appeared to him in physical form or through some other means, and how her simple act of encouragement had set in motion changes that would affect thousands of lives. He thought about Dr. Chen, whose willingness to listen had saved his life, and who now taught other doctors the importance of thorough, patient-centered care. Most of all, he thought about the countless patients who would never know that their lives had been saved by a nurse who died in 1998, but whose compassion continued to ripple forward through time, touching hearts and minds in ways that defied easy explanation. The Grace Rodriguez Foundation continued to grow, expanding its mission beyond patient advocacy to include research into doctor-patient communication, funding for nurses' continuing education, and scholarships for medical students who demonstrated exceptional commitment to patient care. Each year, the foundation gave out the Grace Rodriguez Award to healthcare workers who exemplified her dedication to listening, observing, and advocating for those who might otherwise go unheard. Kenny remained actively involved in the foundation's work until his own death in 2020 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by hundreds of doctors, nurses, and medical students whose lives had been touched by his story and his advocacy work. Dr. Elizabeth Chen delivered one of the eulogies, speaking about how Kenny had taught the medical community that patients are partners in their own care, not just subjects to be examined. Kenny Rogers gave us many gifts during his lifetime, Dr. Chen said to the assembled mourners. His music brought joy to millions, but perhaps his greatest gift was the reminder that healing requires more than medical expertise. It requires the willingness to listen, to believe, and to treat every patient with the dignity and respect they deserve. The story of Kenny's encounter with Grace Rodriguez continues to be told in medical schools across the country, a reminder that the practice of medicine is as much about human connection as it is about scientific knowledge. Students learn about the importance of persistent symptoms, the limitations of single tests, and the value of clinical intuition. But most importantly, they learn about the responsibility that comes with the privilege of caring for others. In the end, Kenny Rogers learned that the most important lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers. That courage can be as simple as refusing to accept an inadequate answer, and that sometimes the people who seem invisible are the ones who see most clearly. The silent guardian had whispered truth in his moment of need, and that whisper continued to echo through the halls of hospitals everywhere, reminding everyone who heard it that we all have the power to be someone's grace, to listen when others dismiss, to see when others overlook, to care when others have grown too busy or too certain to remember that healing begins with recognizing the humanity in every person we encounter. The melody of compassion plays on in cardiac units and emergency rooms, in medical schools and patient advocacy programs, in the quiet moments when healthcare workers remember that their most important tool is not a stethoscope or a computer, but an open heart and a willingness to truly see the people they serve. And sometimes, late at night in hospital corridors, staff members swear they can still feel Grace Rodriguez making her rounds, watching over patients and reminding everyone that in the sacred space where healing happens, we are all connected by the simple, powerful truth that every life has value, every voice deserves to be heard, and every heart beats with the same fundamental need to be seen, understood, and cared for with dignity and compassion.